Hey y'all, it's Trista Curzydlo, and I think I am now live. I had a couple of problems getting on, but I hope that is solved. So if someone out there could send a comment and let me know that you can see me, that would be awesome. Or not. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm just going to assume that you might be able to see me. All right, great. So Penny. All right, super. All right. Now, I want to get started today. And to do that, I want to introduce you to someone. This is Dizzy. Oh! My daughters will let you know that his real name, or his Christian name, as they like to say, is Disney World Curzydlo. And over the last month, as we have been staying home, Dizzy has been dressed up in costumes. He has gone on bike rides in a bicycle basket. He has worn a leash and gone for walks. He has been just a rock star. He's also been the only audience member for quite a few performances, and he has served as a sounding board for people who wanted to talk about some of their insecurities and some of the concerns that they have had about things that are going on in the world. He has been a much better listener for my daughters than I have been during this time. And so when I started thinking about what we should talk about when it comes to fair housing in the month of April, is animals and those folks who rely on their animals more than just as a pet, but instead as someone or something that helps them on a daily basis. And so, of course, that brings us to service animals and assistance animals and guidance that came out of HUD at the end of January 28th of 2020 to be exact. Now, this new guidance does away with the previous guidance from 2013. So it really changes the way that we approach animals when it comes to rental property and someone with a disability who makes a reasonable accommodation request. Now, as a reminder, those reasonable accommodation requests under the Fair Housing Act are available for individuals with a disability, and they are when someone asks you to change a rule and they say, could you change this rule for me? And in changing the rule, it will allow me to enjoy the full access to the property. And so the reasonable accommodation requests that we've seen a lot over the last several years have all dealt with a no pet policy, where someone has requested that the no pet policy be amended to allow for someone with an animal. Unfortunately, we started to see some abuse of that process, and we've seen some changes that are coming out of HUD in the last month, and I'm excited to talk with you about those. Now, there are three different laws that I want to talk about today, not just the Fair Housing Act, but instead the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Air Carrier Access Act, and the Fair Housing Act. So I want to start with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it addresses service animals, and it defines those service animals as dogs, and in some cases, miniature horses. Now, when we look at those dogs and the miniature horses and what they do, they're specifically trained to provide assistance to a disabled person. Now, if you have any questions, could you please let me know? Okay. Now, when we talk about the Air Carrier Access Act, it has historically allowed for service animals as defined under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then emotional support animals. Now, when we think about those emotional support animals, we saw a lot of abuse going on when it came to those. And so some of the more interesting service animal discussions involved things like the emotional support squirrel that was so popular for a while when we were discussing this. And then, all right, Leah, are you seeing me? Okay. Now, so we had the emotional support squirrel where someone had to be kicked off of a flight because their squirrel was disruptive. And then we also had the very popular emotional support peacock article that really went viral for quite a while. Now, in response to those and some of the abuses that airlines were seeing, in January 22nd of 2020, the U.S. Department of Transportation proposed amendments to the regulation of service animals on flights. Now, when we look at what those amendments to the U.S. Department of Transportation's Air Carrier Access Act looked like, it was some pretty significant changes. Specifically, it was looking at defining a service animal as a dog that was going to be allowed on a flight. It followed the ADA definition of service animal. And then it no longer considered an emotional support animal to be a service animal. So instead, the new proposed rules for the Air Carrier Access Act focused on allowing service animals. It also would require an early check-in process. So someone who wanted to bring a support animal on board would need to have a conversation with the airline in advance. In January 28th of 2020, HUD followed the Department of Transportation and it issued new guidance on reasonable accommodation for assistance animals, doing away with the 2013 guidelines. Now, those 2013 guidelines, they were really written by an attorney for the enjoyment of other attorneys. They weren't really written, I think, for the average individual to read and enjoy. And the new guidelines issued this year, they're really written for anyone to read and understand. And so I recommend that you take an opportunity to go on HUD's website and read FHEO Notice 2020-01, the first notice that they issued this year. And those guidelines address the new approach that HUD is taking when it comes to assistance animals. And for those of you who have been involved in rental properties, you'll start to see a major change in HUD's approach to how you're handling these. Now, HUD immediately addresses that over 60% of the Fair Housing Act complaints that they are seeing every year are based on disability as the basis. And one of the major reasons for that is an increase in the number of complaints that they see, or the number of allegations that they see, that are based on reasonable accommodation requests. Now, HUD addresses that and says not all disabilities are visible, not everything, not all of the reasons why someone would need an animal would be immediately visible. And so when we think about that not all disabilities are visible, we're going to take that into consideration and look at how we should approach conversations that involve a reasonable accommodation request. Now, when the reasonable accommodation request comes to you, it is going to say, I have a disability. It does not have to include what that disability is. It does not have to include information about the disability, but instead it says, I have a disability, and as a result of that disability, I would like you to change your policy on animals to allow for my assistance animal. That's the second step that HUD takes, is they do away with all of the various terms that have applied to animals, and instead they have assistance animals. And then under that, they have service animals as defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then they have support animals as addressed by HUD. And support animals are those animals that are not going to be considered service animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act definition, meaning they might not be dogs or they might not have the type of training that the Americans with Disabilities Act requires. They do, however, under the requirements now and the guidance from HUD, they do need to be individually trained to do work or tasks, meaning they are going to perform some type of service for the individual with the disability. And you can ask, what tasks is the animal going to do that will alleviate one or more of the symptoms of the disability? Now, within HUD's guidance, it breaks down best practices. And so, as part of that best practices, it gives you questions that you can ask a client if they are making, or a tenant, if they are making if they're making a reasonable accommodation request. And so, when you look at whether the animal is a dog or not, if it's a dog, then you can ask if it is a service animal under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if not, we can start looking at, is the animal going to be considered a support animal under HUD's new guidance? Now, once the request has been made, this is where things get sticky in the past, where there were concerns about, is this animal, if I have to allow the animal and change my policy, what can happen? Are there situations where I can say no? And now in the new guidance, HUD really walks you through the steps on how you can determine if you should allow the animal or not. And in breaking that down, it states that you can request additional information about the animal, and it also addresses whether or not you can ask, or what types of questions you can ask, what the animal is going to do in order to alleviate one or more of the symptoms. And it also addresses the internet. Now, what's interesting is over the past several years, you've been able to go online and you can Google emotional support animal letter. And for $5, maybe a little bit more, you can find information about how to get an emotional support animal letter that you could provide to your landlord. Now, HUD addresses that and says, we realize that there are telemedicine, and certainly in this day and age, a lot of us are depending on telemedicine. And they say, we recognize that telemedicine exists and it provides a good service, but we also need to look at, are there any questions so far? I'm not seeing any questions, and it's making me a little nervous that I'm not really streaming. Now, when we look at what they say about the internet, while they recognize that telemedicine exists and that telemedicine provides a good service, they do say that you can discuss the actual relationship between the service provider and the individual asking for the request. So that's a major change, and one that strengthens a lot of landlords' positions. Then the other thing is the type of animal. Now, in the past, when someone would ask for a reasonable accommodation to be made, all animals were sort of lumped in together. And now that we have service animals being dogs under the ADA and support animals being recognized by HUD, it actually breaks down support animals into two categories. The first are those animals that are commonly kept in households. So the type of animals that we historically have seen as pets. And that includes my guinea pig here, as well as other dogs that might not be service animals, cats, those traditional animals, fishes, turtles, those types of things. And then it has a category for unique animals. And unique animals are those animals not commonly kept as pets, including things like monkeys. And the reason I bring up monkeys is it's addressed in HUD's guidance, where it says, now we have this exotic animal, we have this unique animal that's not something commonly kept. In order to approve that, when we look at if it's a reasonable accommodation, you can ask, what does this animal do that a commonly kept animal, a common household pet, would not be able to do? And monkey's the example that HUD gives because it discusses if the monkey is trained to open jars or doors or something where you would need to have the ability to turn something, then the monkey would be something that could be perceived as a reasonable accommodation that we would be expected to make. Now, HUD's guidance also discusses, when it comes to unique animals, that instead of the alleviation or decreasing one or more symptoms of the disability, it would actually need to be demonstrated that the symptoms of the disability would increase if we weren't to allow the unique animal to live with the tenant. Now, the new guidance also addresses a few questions that people have had in the past, and that includes the allergies of other tenants. And it makes it very clear that the allergies of other tenants can be taken into consideration, and health concerns of other tenants can be taken into consideration. So, if the allergen from the animal can't be mitigated and it could negatively impact other tenants or other people in the building, then that would be a reason that the reasonable accommodation could be denied. The same rule that existed in the past through the 2013 FHEO guidance, where if the animal itself has a history, then that can be denied. That rule is still in place. You cannot deny a reasonable accommodation request for an animal based solely on the breed of the animal or the type of the animal, unless, and this is a good clarification from HUD, if allowing that breed or that particular animal would negatively impact the financial situation. So, if your insurance provider were to say, we will not allow, we won't continue coverage at the rate that we have been providing coverage because you've allowed this particular breed in, then, and we're going to drop your coverage, then that would be a reason to say no to the reasonable accommodation request. Now, I'm going to leave reasonable accommodation requests in animals again with the recommendation that you take some time out of your day and read FHEO 20-1, the first FHEO to come from from HUD this year. Take the opportunity to read that. It's got some really great guidance for you that I think could really help you. Now, I haven't seen any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end my live video, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.